Assalamu alaikum and welcome to lecture number 4 of Criminology. Today we will be covering Émile Durkheim's Anomie theory. Now, this person, he is not necessarily a criminologist, but a well celebrated sociologist. So, he's going to explain criminology via the lens of the society. We will be focusing on, again, it is going to be a positivistic school of thought, since we will be explaining the reasons for crime, depending on the external agents. We will not be focusing on the individual himself, the one who commits crime, but all the factors, the society, and everything around him that makes him commit a certain act. Before we dive into the theory, we need to understand who is Emil Durkheim and what he believes in. So this guy is basically the one who believes that there is no such thing as a crime. He firmly believes that it's the society, it's the view of society that decides what is considered as a crime and what is considered not as a crime. And we know that morality, ethics, these are relativistic terms. What is considered moral in one society may or may not be considered moral in another society. So similarly, what is considered a crime in one society might not be a crime in another society. Even in the same society, what might be considered a crime today might not be considered a crime 100 years from now. So, in this context, you can understand simply the example of homosexual marriages. They were frowned upon, even 100 years ago. But now it's almost like everyone is familiar with the term. So it is as if crime is not something rigid, it is something ever evolving. And he also believes that this crime, quote unquote crime or deviance, it is very necessary in any society and it is very natural in a society too. And it is very important for evolution of a particular society. So let's just dive into what this guy actually believes and what is his thought process before we can understand what is his theory about. Now, this guy believes crime is any action deemed offensive against the collective feelings or sentiments reflecting society's value. So, every society has a set of values, either they're derived from their religion or they're just from the history or whatever. Now, when anyone goes against certain values, majority of people they are offended, then we believe, okay, this act, since it offended a large number of people, this act must be considered as a crime. So for an act to be considered as a crime or not, it is very important to view it whether through the perspective of the society. Now Durkheim emphasized that notion of crime varies again. And he also believed that crime is inevitable, it is constant phenomenon in every society, and it serves as a mirror to societal norms and their evolution. Crime is very important for change. Crime involves resistance. So crime is a key trigger for a societal change. And crime is also an indicator that old systems are no longer functional. Old systems are no longer effective for society, and something needs to change. Now, he believes what are the functions of crime? Number one, he believes there's adaptive function to crime. That is, crime introduces new ideas and drives social change. Now remember, when society has a it has certain values, it has this collective consciousness about what is good and what is wrong. It is rigid. This system is not flexible. So any sort of deviance or any sort of crime introduces novelty, and this novelty it drives the social change. Here there is example of civil rights movement. They were initially called as criminal because people usually view any sort of change as something non-ethical, and they resist the change and they just label it with all sort of negative connotations in order to minimize the effect. Second, there is boundary maintenance. Boundary maintenance is it reinforces social values through collective action against deviance. Now, when we are saying crime is actually any act that is offending majority of the population. Now, of course, the resentment, the frowning, the resistance, even the anger from the rest of the society, it is going to, it is important. It will maintain a boundary. It will act as a deterrent. It will establish whatever is the, norm in that society. Third, it is a normal element. Where there is conformity, there is deviance. One cannot exist without the other. If we say that people conform, be- that means that there are certain people who do not conform to the society, and such people are called as deviant. Such people are called as criminals. So crime is normal part of any society, and it is very important too. Now we have understood the background, the thought process of Émile Durkheim's about the concept of crime. Now, in any society, society is simply, societies do not exist. They cannot exist without solidarity. Now, societies have two kind of solidarity. It's either mechanical solidarity or organic solidarity. Now, this mechanical solidarity, it is the kind of solidarity which we believe were in the primitive humans, the hunter gatherers, based on similarity, where the purpose of punishment was to ensure uniformity. Now, every tribeman was, a hunter. Everyone would work. They did not have any, stark differences in their division of labor. And traditional societies were there, and they had very strong communal tie. So anyone who would deviate, he would be punished. And the purpose of punishment was simply to ensure uniformity. The kind of solidarity that exists nowadays in society, it is organic solidarity. It is based on differences. And this solidarity can only be maintained by regulating interaction between different societal parts. You know, This organic solidarity, it has been explained by Emile Durkheim by comparing it with the human body. In human body, there are different organs, and all organs they have different functions. Similarly, in our modern society, there are different sects, there are different classes, there are different societal parts, and all parts they work together for peace of a particular society. Now let's move towards his theory. So, Emile Durkheim, a sociologist, sorry, he gave this theory called as anomie theory. Now, nomie is for norm, values that a society has. Anomie is simply normlessness. When society loses its norms, when society loses its values, when society basically loses that collective consciousness that made it a particular unit, that made that particular society stand against any sort of deviant act. When there are no norms, there is no solidarity. Now, what causes normlessness? So, Durkheim believes that whenever there is some sort of change, any sort of economic change, let's say, now here the society goes through evolution. In this process, what happens is that the old values, they are no longer applicable. These values, they are not applicable, and new norms and new values, they have not yet been introduced. So it is that society is evolving, but it has not yet fully evolved. It is somewhere between the old and new, that abyss, this confusion, this chaos, where there are certain people who have adapted to whatever is coming next. They are being proactive, they're adapting to the new change. And there are certain people who are sticking to the old norms. And in all this, that whole collective consciousness of society, that collective perspective of society, it just gets disintegrated, it gets lost. Now, in this confusion, in this chaos, there comes suicide. Now, it is important to understand why Durkheim uses the word suicide. Now, suicide in certain countries, in certain states and places, it is considered as a crime. But if you analyze and compare it with all other different kinds of crime, suicide is one of the crime that is the most individual and most personal one. It is a kind of crime that possibly, if we ignore the psychological parts, it possibly has the least effect on society as a whole. So he chose this because suicide was very common in Paris at that time. He also chose this because he wanted to he wanted to argue that even the basic and the individual and most personal sort of act of deviance, it was too influenced by the society. Society and societal structure and their the whole thing, it did affect a particular person to perform an act of deviance. So again, this is a positivistic approach. Now, Durkheim has two important works. Number one is Division of Labor in Society, 1893. This is the book where he used the word anomie. Then there is another work that is Suicide in 1897. Émile Durkheim used term anomie, literally meaning without law or normlessness, to describe social condition where shared norms and values lose their power to regulate people's behavior. Remember, whenever you're doing something, your behavior, it is usually learned through your environment, and in your environment what exists, your society, it exists. So your behavior, it is regulated via the society. You view yourself through the lens of society before performing any act in order to see if it would be deemed acceptable or not. So if the society is normless, now the society is unable to tell people what they are supposed to do with their life, what they are, yeah, how they are supposed to act, and how they are supposed not to act. Now, in this confusion, there comes a situation where there's nihilism, where there's existentialism, where there's lack of purpose. Person cannot understand what is he supposed to do, if what he's doing is right or wrong, and there is this chaos between what he knew to be right before and how the society has changed the perception. So there's a lot of confusion. There's identity crisis. All this at times of a social change. So, in simple terms, when society's rules break down, people no longer know what is expected of them. Since there are no rules, they do not know how to, get social approval. And the moral boundaries, they have also become unclear. Now, Durkheim saw anomie as a key problem in modern society, especially it is a problem during the time of rapid change. So, what Durkheim is basically saying, he's saying that individual for his own well-being, for in his own sense of purpose, he needs social regulation. He needs approval. He needs to know what is expected of him. And if he is not able to know what is expected of him, if he is not able to regulate with society, then he is going to, become suicidal, and this will lead to deviance and this would lead to crime. Now, here's the famous quote from his book, A Study in Sociology, that was from Suicide, his work that was published in 1897. Now, man cannot become attached to higher aims and submit to a rule if he sees nothing above him to which he belongs. Now, remember, people, there is this ego self that is his individual being, and then there is a collective sense of self that comes from society. So, man, if he is not attached to some higher aim, and if he is not submitting to a rule, if he sees that there's nothing above him to which he belongs, to free him from all social pressure is to abandon him to himself and demoralize him. So, this is basically the crux of what Emile Durkheim wants to say. He's saying a man He integrates in a society. He lives in society. He considers himself as a part of society, and he is basically a unit of that collective whole. So he feels protected, he feels regulated, he feels socially important, and he feels sense of purpose because he understands that he has a role to play. He's a part of this big collective consciousness. But when there's the society and the whole structure, it has disintegrated. There's a lot of chaos, there's confusion. Now there's no social pressure. He knows that there are so many options before him, and he does not know a particular dogma or particular norm to stick by. In this situation is the situation that would ultimately demoralize him. And this would ultimately lead to suicide because he is disappointed, he is disoriented, he does not know, he does not understand what is expected of him. And this disorientation has resulted from the breakdown of regulation that he had before. Now, here he also divides suicide into different types. There's fatalistic suicide. Fatalistic is caused by excessive regulation, exemplified by slaves or oppressed groups. Now, it is not necessary that it is only the lack of regulation that can cause suicide, but he also believes that when the oppressed groups, they have strong bonds, they are excessively regulated, but they are not so much integrated though. So this leads to fatalistic suicide. Then there's anomic suicide, lack of regulation at the time of economic crisis. Then there's egoistic suicide. Now, this is the kind of suicide that mostly happens in single people. They are not integrated. They do not have, social ties. Then there's altruistic suicide, which mostly occurs in people who are working in military. That is altruistic suicide. Now that we have understood what Durkheim means and what his theory stands for, it is important that we critically analyze his work. So, first of all, there will be political critique. In this, it's somehow this theory reinforces the state control. This theory says that social norms and social structures and collective consciousness, it is very important for the mental and moral well-being of any individual. So somehow reinforces that the state should, control, and the state should regulate everything. So it is slightly inclined towards authoritarianism. For example, post 9/11 security measures. It can be used to justify increased surveillance as well. Normlessness can enable political resistance against unjust power structures, protest against systemic inequality. Now, normlessness, it is not necessarily something that would lead to, individuals just annihilating themselves and just getting being done with life. Normlessness can also be, a positive thing because it can, cause it can normlessness basically is the situation which is offering us a pathway, a route towards a society in which there are new norms. It is basically when you're leaving the past behind and you're going towards the future, it's the abyss that is in the middle. Philosophically, philosophical critique is that Durkheim sees collective conscience as a source of moral purpose and meaning. So it is all he does not think that individuals have their own sense of purpose. He does not build. It is like his opinion is not individualistic enough. He just views moral purpose and meaning to be something that is external of the man, which is actually, again, not so true. Then there is sociological reductionism. S- This critique basically says that it neglects the subjective experience. It neglects the individual agency, what he felt, what happened to him, all of that, his psychological process. This whole theory, it focuses so much on society that it ignores the individual or the culprit or the suicidal man, his own biology, what makes him do a certain thing or what makes him not do a certain thing. It ignores all of that. It simply reduces crime to sociology. It simply blames society for all of that. So here is this map that we have studied of Durkheim's Anomie theory. Now, this theory, though initially it did get a lot of praise, later it was criticized a lot. It had a weird shelf life, you can say, like any theory. So basically, we have understood that Durkheim's Anomie is saying number one, there's breakdown of regulation, either during the time of crisis or any sort of social change. And in this, people lack clear moral guidance because uh, consider the example, rapid industrialization, economic booms and bursts, they can they create these anomic conditions where their scale of wealth and their legitimate needs is dramatically absent. It leaves individual without clear moral guidance on what they should do or what they should not do. And it's in such conditions there is this condition of suicide. It is lack of moral regulation, and it is feeling of disappointment and disorientation. Later, Merton also expanded on this idea and he gave a theory which is called as strain theory. And in strain theory, he is not referring much to the disintegration of the collective consciousness of uh, uh, of the society, but rather he says that there are discrepancies between culturally approved goals and legitimate means to achieve them. That is what causes uh, you know um, deviance. That would be covered inshallah in the next lecture. This was all about Durkheim's concept of anomaly.